Give your stepsister the $25 million. You do not deserve it." My stepmother, Linda, did not whisper that. She threw it across the Christmas dinner table in our house in Cedar Park outside Austin. The mashed potatoes dish rattled, a glass of red wine slid across the white tablecloth, and every head turned toward me, as if I had done something wrong just by sitting there. Linda pointed the carving knife at me. "All of it," she said. "Transfer the full $25 million to Brianna. She actually deserves a future." The number did not shock me. The way the room agreed with her did. Chairs creaked. No one told her to stop. "You were always the strange one with your little computer things," Linda went on. "Brianna knows how to live. She would not hide alone staring at a screen." My father, Mark, did not defend me. He stared at his plate. "Chloe family comes first," he murmured. "Your stepsister needs a chance. You have more than enough." An aunt nodded and said I was stable. A cousin laughed and said it would be selfish to hold on to that much. In a few minutes, they moved me from daughter to problem, from person to source of cash. Then Linda slipped. "We have talked about this for months," she said. "Everyone here knows it is the right thing." My stomach went cold. Months. Everyone here. They had already decided what to do with my money before I walked through the door. I did not shout. Anger rose, then narrowed into something else. Because there was one thing Linda did not know. The $25 million she repeated like a magic number was only what she could see. Underneath, there was a quiet piece of a company in San Francisco, a rental house in Round Rock, and an account that did not carry my personal name. Most important, the bulk of the payout sat inside a limited liability company in Delaware, under a name my family had never heard. To them, I was good with computers. To the bank that had emailed me earlier that day, I was a high-value profile someone had just tried and failed to touch. 10 minutes before Linda called everyone to the table, my watch had buzzed. Unusual login attempt, the alert read. High-value transaction blocked. The small map showed my father's address. I had stared at it, felt a chill, and hit dismiss. Then I had taken my seat at this table full of people who were already spending my money in their heads. My name is Chloe Vance. I am 29 years old, and I did not inherit those $25 million. I built them one long year at a time. I live in Austin and work as a senior data and product analyst for a grocery delivery startup called Cartwave. I joined when the chairs did not match and the ceiling leaked. In August, a bigger company bought Cartwave. The stock options my family once called pretend turned into a payout of about $25 million after taxes. I did not buy a mansion. I kept my small apartment and an ordinary car. None of that mattered here. My father is a retired teacher who hates conflict. Linda runs a salon and loves to look successful. My stepsister, Brianna, is 26, always chasing followers, always behind on her cards. Instead of seeing my work as mine, they quietly labeled it family property and waited to collect. "You think you are special because some app did well," Linda said now. "You would not have a roof if Mark had not taken you in." A few people chuckled. Someone called me Miss Tech Money. Someone else joked that I was a robot always working, never living. Brianna shrugged. "Come on," she said. "You are single, no kids." I actually need it. I could have reminded them what I had already done, the hospital bill I paid when my father was sick, the credit card of Linda's I cleared when she cried about her lease. They told those stories later without my name. Tonight, they did not even bother to pretend. Those memories rose now and settled behind my ribs like a wall. I looked around the table and asked one question. "So you all decided this without me?" No one denied it. My father gave a small shrug. In that moment, something very calm settled in my chest. The account they were circling was a shallow pool, a checking account with a few $100,000 in it. The rest of what they thought they were claiming sat behind paperwork they had never seen. They believed they were about to take control. In truth, they were pounding on the wrong door. I folded my napkin and set it beside my plate. "Thank you for making this so clear," I said. My voice did not shake. Then I stood up and walked away from the table. No one called after me. Outside, the late December air was cold. I sat in my car and opened the bank alert again. The blocked attempt lined up with the time Linda had told everyone to sit down. The map showed my father's address. I stared at it until the hurt in my chest turned into something steadier. This was not just an ugly dinner. This was an attempt to reach into my life and take what they felt entitled to. If you have ever been treated more like a wallet than a daughter, if people who should have loved you only measured you in dollars, you are not alone. If you are still here with me, type "still here" in the comments or tell me where you are watching from. My name is Chloe, and this is only the beginning of what happened next. When I think back to being 9 years old, it is strange how clearly I can still feel the weight of rooms that were never mine, and the quiet knowledge that I would never be the child anyone chose first. And even then I understood something was wrong, because before the accident, my mother had been the kind of woman who knelt beside me during homework and whispered that numbers were a language I could command if I wanted. But after she died on that stretch of highway outside San Antonio, everything felt like it flipped onto its back and refused to right itself again. And when my father remarried 2 years later and we moved into Linda's house in Cedar Park, I already knew it would not be a place where softness lived. It would be a place where expectations pressed on my shoulders from dawn until night. I remember carrying laundry baskets that were almost my size while Linda painted her nails at the kitchen table, and the smell of acetone filled the air as she told me to stop dragging my feet because girls needed to learn responsibility early. Meanwhile, Brianna, who was only a little younger than me, twirled in a new dress and asked if we could stop by her friend's birthday later, and Linda said, "Of course, sweetie," while handing her $20 for a gift. And I stood there in my faded t-shirt knowing no one would ever hand me money so easily, because every time I asked for something, I heard the same phrase girls should learn to save, not spend, so I saved everything, including my feelings. I became good at washing dishes without clattering them and watching the clock whenever Linda needed errands done and tiptoeing around her moods, which could shift like Texas weather. And when Brianna wanted to play, she demanded I be the sidekick or the villain, never the hero. And I agreed, because there was no point resisting someone who had already been crowned the favored daughter in every room she entered. School became my escape, and when I brought home an A+ on a math test, I thought maybe that would matter, maybe that would make someone proud. But Linda glanced at the paper and laughed in that dismissive way she had and said, "Grades are nice, but they do not help you be a good wife someday." And I felt something small and bright inside me wrinkle a little. My father overheard but did not defend me. He only said, "Linda has a point." And I learned then that silence can feel heavier than shouting. It fills the spaces where love should be. I kept pushing forward, though, because even at 9, I felt a strange pull toward possibility, toward the idea that if I worked hard enough, I could outrun the expectations in that house. So I studied at night when everyone else was watching television and solved math problems by the light of a lamp that flickered on its lowest setting to avoid Linda complaining that electricity was expensive. It was one of those nights when I first heard my father and Linda whispering in the hallway, their voices low and tense, and I crept closer because something in me knew the conversation had to do with me, and I caught pieces of sentences about tuition and emergencies and needing funds, but I did not understand the full meaning until months later when I saw a letter addressed to my father on the counter. I had learned to recognize official envelopes because my mother used to keep all her financial papers neatly stacked, and curiosity tugged at me. So I opened the letter, even though I knew I should not, and what I read made my stomach drop. It was a statement from the college savings plan. My mother had opened for me a 529 account she had started when I was a toddler, and the balance showed 0, completely emptied. And I stared at that number for a long time, trying to make sense of it. Because my mother had talked about that fund the way other parents talked about hope. She used to say, "Someday this will carry you farther than I ever could." And now it had vanished without warning. When I asked my father about it later, his face changed in that tired way it did. Whenever something uncomfortable came up, he rubbed the bridge of his nose and said, "Times were hard, and Linda had needed help with her own mother's medical bills, and he said it as if it were obvious, as if the money set aside for my future should naturally morph into a solution for someone else's crisis. And what hurt most was not that the money was gone, but that no one thought I deserved a say in the decision. I walked to my room, closed the door, and sat on the floor with my back against the bed, because I felt small and unsteady, and in that moment something inside me rearranged itself. A thread snapped and tied itself into a harder knot, and I understood for the first time that in this family, my needs would always be optional, and my sacrifices would always be expected, and that even the gifts my mother had left me were not safe here. It was not anger I felt then, but a quiet shift, a recognition that if I ever wanted a future, I could trust I would have to build it myself, with no promises from anyone in this house. I did not cry because crying would have given the moment more power than it deserved. Instead, I sat there breathing slowly while the ceiling fan hummed above me, and I promised myself that one day I would have enough control over my own life, that no one could take anything from me again without looking me directly in the eye. It was a promise born from loss, from the slow realization that I was never going to be the child anyone protected, and I carried that truth with me for years, like a thin, sharp stone in my pocket, a reminder that even at 9, I was already learning the first rule of survival in a house where love had conditions: guard everything you can, because no one else will guard it for you. Growing older did not soften the feeling that I was always slightly out of place in my own family, and by the time I left Cedar Park for Austin to attend the university, there I carried that awareness like a quiet companion. It sharpened me in ways no one noticed, because while other students arrived with boxes of new clothes and parents who fussed over dorm layouts, I showed up with 2 suitcases, a used laptop, and the determination to earn every inch of the future I wanted. I worked morning shifts at a Starbucks on Guadalupe, steaming milk before sunrise and wiping syrup from counters while memorizing formulas for my calculus exam. Then I rushed to class, then to the library, then back to my tiny apartment to code small freelance projects for $40 or $60 at a time, slowly teaching myself how data moved through systems and how patterns inside those numbers could behave like clues if you learned how to read them. No one at home asked what I was studying or how I was managing. They only reminded me that tuition was expensive and that it was good. I was learning to be independent, which was their way of saying they did not expect to help. So I did not tell them when professors praised my work or when a recruiter wrote that my small project mapping delivery routes had caught his attention, and when that same recruiter called months later about an opening at a young company called Cartwave. I listened while sitting at my kitchen table surrounded by empty ramen cups, feeling a strange spark inside my chest because the idea of joining something small and unpolished felt like stepping into a world where effort mattered more than pedigree. I accepted the offer as employee 18 walked into a converted warehouse that smelled like old wood and warm servers, and realized immediately that this was a place where no one cared if you came from a family that never believed in you. They only cared if you could solve the next problem. My first days were a blur of spreadsheets, failed models, late nights, and cheap takeout, and I loved it. I loved watching our metrics shift as we implemented new ideas. I loved sitting between software engineers who treated me like an equal despite my age, and when the founders handed me a packet detailing my stock option grant, I felt a quiet thrill not because of the money, but because someone finally acknowledged what I could become. I did not tell my family about the options because a year earlier, when I had mentioned the word startup at Thanksgiving, Linda had laughed so loudly the neighbors might have heard she said, "Only children chase dreams like that. Real adults get stable jobs and stop pretending the world owes them something." My father nodded and said stability is important, and Brianna asked if I was getting paid in toy money since startups always collapse. So when I signed the stock agreements, I kept the papers folded in my backpack like a secret seed I needed to protect from cold winds. As the years passed, I stayed at Cartwave, learning the logic of supply chains and the rhythm of customer behavior and the art of predicting outcomes before the data even settled. And as my salary grew, I began sending money home each month to help with the mortgage, because my father had dropped hints about falling behind, but I asked him not to mention it to Linda because I knew she would turn my help into her triumph. And of course she did. Anyway, she told neighbors that Mark was working himself to the bone to keep the house secure. For everyone, she said it loudly in grocery aisles and at church events, while I listened over the phone and stared at the ceiling, wondering how it was possible to be so invisible and so useful at the same time. My days became a pattern of quiet growth. I wrote code on the bus, learned advanced analytics at night, and never complained because something in me believed that if I worked hard enough, I could outrun the memory of that emptied college fund and the years of being dismissed as the boring girl who only cared about homework. So when Cartwave raised its Series B funding and the internal valuation skyrocketed, turning my on-paper equity into nearly $3 million, I felt something electric pulse through me. It was not greed or pride, it was proof that I had been right to trust myself all along, that the girl who once sat on the floor of her room holding a letter that stole her future had rebuilt that future with her own hands. I wanted to share that moment. I wanted to call home and say I had made it not for validation, but because a small part of me still longed for someone to say they were proud. So I dialed the house that evening. And when Linda answered, I told her in a careful voice that something exciting had happened at work, that my company had been funded, that it was a big step. And before I could finish, she cut in and said she was busy with a television show and that I should call back later because she could not miss the dramatic part. Then she hung up without even asking what the news was. I sat there holding the phone, feeling the warmth of my accomplishment shift into something colder, something familiar. And I realized that no matter how much I achieved, they would always see me as the quiet girl who washed dishes and studied too much, the one whose successes were uninteresting until they became useful. I did not call back instead. I opened my laptop and stared at the option dashboard, the rising numbers reflected in the faint glow on my face, and I made a small promise to myself, the same kind I made at 9 years old, that if anyone ever tried to take what I had built, I would be ready this time, not with anger, but with knowledge strategy, and the quiet certainty that everything I had was earned and protected, not by luck or inheritance, but by work no one had bothered to see. By the time Cartwave entered its 6th year, I had stopped imagining the liquidity event that everyone in the startup world talks about, because dreaming felt dangerous when you grew up in a house where milestones were ignored or twisted into burdens. So when the acquisition finally happened in August and an email arrived from our finance department with the subject line tender offer details, I stared at the screen for a long moment, trying to understand that the numbers I was seeing were real, that the stock options tucked away in my backpack years earlier were about to turn into a sum so large it hardly felt connected to my life. I sat in my quiet apartment while cicadas buzzed outside in the late Texas heat, reading the line that spelled out my after-tax payout, $25 million, a number that felt surreal, not because I had not earned it, but because it was so far beyond anything my younger self could have imagined on those nights she studied by the flickering lamp. And I did not scream or call anyone. I just placed my hands flat on the table and breathed until the shock melted into a calm warmth, a steady kind of pride that came from knowing this was mine, built slowly, piece by piece, with no shortcuts and no guarantees. I celebrated in the smallest way I knew how I bought myself an upgrade from the old sedan that had been coughing through every commute and drove home a modest Tesla Model 3. The basic version, the one with no performance package and no flashy upgrades. And I remember thinking how strange it was that even in a moment this big, I wanted to stay small, wanted my life to remain grounded, wanted no one to see anything that might attract the hungry eyes I remembered too well from childhood. I did not buy a penthouse or take a vacation or post a photo. I made pasta in my tiny kitchen and looked out the window while the Austin skyline glowed in the distance. And for the first time, I allowed myself to think that maybe, just maybe, the promise I made at 9 years old had been kept. A week later, I drove to Cedar Park to visit my father because the guilt of keeping this news to myself tugged at me, though a deeper instinct warned me that telling them would not bring celebration, only calculation, and I should have listened to that instinct more closely because the trouble began in the simplest way, the kind of slip that seems harmless until the consequences unfold. I had set my phone on the kitchen counter while helping fold laundry when a notification flashed across the lock screen, showing a positive movement in Cartwave stock, a harmless alert to me, but a spark to someone like Brianna, who drifted into the room at the wrong moment, her eyes flicking toward the phone like a cat spotting something shiny. And she asked in that casual tone she used when she was fishing for information, "Hey, what is that? Did your company go public or something?" And I tucked the phone into my pocket and said it was nothing important, just routine updates from work. But I could already feel suspicion growing in the room like a slow leak of cold air. The next morning, Linda cornered me while I was rinsing dishes, wiping her hands on a towel as she asked in a voice that pretended to be light, "So how much did they give you when the company sold? I heard from Brianna that things are going very well for you. Must be exciting," and without waiting for an answer. She pushed again. "What is it? A couple $100,000, that is nice. You deserve to relax a little." Though her eyes said something different, something sharper, as if she were already dividing the sum in her head. I felt my stomach tighten, because I knew that tone, the probing sweetness, the false interest that wrapped itself around a demand not yet spoken, and I answered carefully enough for me to be stable for a while, nothing dramatic, and tried to steer the conversation elsewhere, but Linda did not let go. She circled back throughout the day asking small questions with big intentions, and the way she watched me made it clear she was trying to read what I would not say aloud. By the time I drove back to Austin that evening, I knew two things with absolute certainty: that my family had caught the scent of a fortune, and that everything I had built was now at risk if I did not protect it quickly and thoroughly. I sat at my desk that night with my laptop open and the numbers from my payout displayed on the screen, and I realized that for the first time in my life, I had something that could not be replaced if someone managed to take it from me. I thought about the emptied college fund, about the years of invisible labor, about the way my father had caved under Linda's voice again and again, and I understood that secrecy was not paranoia, it was survival. The next morning, I scheduled a consultation with a financial attorney in Austin, a calm man with gray glasses who listened without judgment as I explained that I needed a structure to hold my assets separate from my personal accounts. Something quiet, something unassuming, something no one could casually peek into, even if they tried. He recommended an entity in Delaware, a limited liability company with strong privacy protections, and we filed the papers that same afternoon with me listed only in the internal documents, not the public registry. We named it Quiet North Holdings, a title that suited the way I had lived my entire life, strong but silent, steady but unseen. And as I signed the paperwork, I felt the strangest sense of relief, as if I had locked a door I did not even know had been open. By the end of the week, most of my payout had been transferred into the LLC, shielded from curious relatives, shielded from anyone who believed my success was theirs to redistribute, and I kept one modest personal account with enough to cover daily life because I did not want any pattern to look unusual. No one knew, not my father, not Linda, not Brianna, with her sharp eyes and restless ambition, and as I closed my laptop that night, I felt something settle inside me, a quiet readiness, because I sensed what was coming before it arrived. The shift in their voices, the probing questions, the entitlement that always blooms when people smell money that is not theirs, and I knew this time I was not the 9-year-old girl discovering her future had been emptied without her consent. This time, I was prepared. In the weeks after I moved my assets into Quiet North Holdings, I began to feel a faint sense of calm, a kind of quiet vigilance that let me move through my days without showing how alert I truly was. Yet the shift in my family's behavior arrived faster than I expected, subtle at first, then unmistakable like a draft sliding under a locked door. Linda started calling more often, her tone sweet in the way honey can be sweet, only when it is meant to trap something. She asked how work was and whether I was eating enough. Then, without pausing, she slipped in the question. She actually wanted to ask, "The stove has been acting strange and we really need to redo the kitchen. Nothing fancy, just 30,000 or so. It is nothing to someone like you." And I felt my jaw tighten because she said it as if my life had become a public account she could access whenever she felt inconvenienced. I told her gently that I could not commit to anything like that, trying to maintain the distance I needed, but she either did not hear me or refused to hear me, because the next day I received 3 texts about countertop samples and renovation timelines. And before I could respond, Brianna sent me a link to a downtown condo with floor-to-ceiling windows, writing in her usual carefree tone that she had found her dream home only $650,000, and she added a little note saying she could finally move out if she had some help with the down payment, implying I should feel proud to enable that milestone. I stared at the screen in disbelief, wondering if this was the same girl who used to mock my studying, the same girl who said success was for boring people, and yet here she was, treating my work as a convenient extension of her lifestyle. I ignored the message, hoping the silence would serve as an answer. But silence only created space for more demands, never restraint. As Christmas approached, I agreed reluctantly to attend a small dinner the week before the holiday, because my father asked, and because somewhere deep inside me, a small sliver of hope still wished interactions might stay civil. But that hope shattered before we even finished setting the table. Linda stood near the oven, her arms crossed, watching me as if waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And when we all sat down, she leaned back and said in a slow, deliberate voice, "If you really loved this family, you would help us be comfortable. What is the point of being rich if you are alone?" And the room went still because she had never said it so plainly before, never dropped the pretense of concern. My father cleared his throat and looked at me with that familiar mixture of weakness and expectation. "Chloe, do not be selfish. Families support each other in times like these," he said, and I felt that old ache rise in me, the one that remembered how easily he had let my college fund evaporate, the one that knew he would always choose harmony with Linda over fairness with me. I pushed my fork aside and stared at the table, wondering when exactly I had stopped being a daughter and become a resource, a reservoir they felt entitled to tap into, as though the money existed not because I had earned it, but because fate intended to deliver it to them through my hands. I left early that night, muttering something about an early meeting. My chest tight as I drove back to Austin, and I promised myself again that I would keep my boundaries firm, but promises alone do not shield you from what you cannot see. The twist came a few days later, sharp and accidental, the kind of revelation that shakes you, because it shows the truth without trying to hide. I had stopped by the house again, because my father claimed he needed help resetting the Wi-Fi router, and while I waited in the kitchen for the modem to reboot, I passed by Linda's laptop, which she had left open on the dining table. A spreadsheet glowed on the screen with neat columns and colored cells, and at first I thought it was a salon schedule or financial record. But then I read the title at the top, Chloe Contribution Plan, and my stomach sank as I scrolled down, seeing line after line, detailing not requests but obligations amounts they had already assigned to me without a single conversation. The list included the entire remaining mortgage on their house, the down payment for Brianna's $650,000 condo, a $200,000 investment for Linda to expand her salon into a second location, and monthly allowances they intended me to provide so they could live comfortably while I continued working. And at the bottom, in a bold text, there was a projected 5-year plan showing how much they could save if I contributed consistently. I stood completely still, watching the cursor blink in the corner of the document, feeling heat rise behind my eyes, not from sadness, but from the shock of how casually they had carved up my life, how easily they had transformed my success into a communal resource, how certain they were that I would never resist. It was not the demands that broke something inside me, but the organization of it, the calculation, the certainty that my wealth was not mine, but a family asset they could allocate at will. And suddenly, the past few months snapped into place. The probing questions, the renovation hints, the dream condo links, all of it woven into this quiet blueprint of entitlement. I closed the laptop gently and walked to the living room where my father sat watching television. And for a moment, I considered confronting him, asking how he could let them plan my life this way. But his eyes looked tired and far away, and I realized he did not see anything wrong with what they were doing. He believed this was normal. This was family cooperation. This was everyone pitching in for the greater good, as long as the greater good never required anything from them. I drove home in silence that night, the road stretching dark and open between Cedar Park and Austin, and as the city lights reappeared on the horizon, I felt something shift inside me, a resolve hardening like cooled steel, because this was no longer just about boundaries or respect. This was about survival, about protecting the life I had built from people who believed they had the right to dismantle it. Christmas in Cedar Park had always felt slightly artificial to me, a collection of staged smiles and mismatched decorations that never quite masked the strain beneath the surface. But that year, the air inside my father's house felt different the moment I stepped through the door, heavier, somehow as if every person present already knew something I did not. The smell of roasted turkey lingered in the hallway, mingling with the faint scent of cinnamon candles Linda liked to place everywhere, and the living room glowed with warm lights that reflected off ornaments Brianna had arranged to look effortless and curated at the same time. My father moved slowly from the kitchen to greet me, his shoulders hunched in a way that made him seem smaller. But before he could say anything, Linda swept into the room with an energy that felt too bright, too rehearsed, and she announced loudly that everyone should take their seats because dinner was ready, her voice slicing through the chatter like a signal that the show was about to begin. I took my place at the long wooden table, noticing the faces around me. My Uncle Thomas with his booming laugh, my Aunt Celia, who always watched everything with narrowed eyes, two cousins who had barely spoken to me in years, and Brianna sitting across from me in a sequined dress, scrolling through her phone until Linda shot her a warning look. There was something performative in the way they arranged themselves, something staged in the way Linda hovered at the head of the table, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. At first, the conversation stayed polite, drifting through topics like weather and holiday plans, but tension hummed just beneath it, the kind of tension that grows inside closed rooms when people are preparing for something unpleasant. Then as plates were being passed around and I reached for the mashed potatoes, Linda slammed her wine glass onto the table so hard the stem cracked, the sharp sound freezing the room in a single suspended breath. And before anyone could recover, she pointed at me and said in a loud, trembling voice, "Give your stepsister the $25 million. You do not deserve it." The words felt familiar because I had heard them earlier that week in a different tone, a quieter cruelty. But this time, they echoed through a room full of people bouncing off walls decorated with garlands and cheap ribbon. And for a moment, the world tilted slightly as every face turned toward me with a strange mixture of interest and pity. My fingers tightened around the serving spoon, the mashed potatoes wobbling in their bowl, and I met Linda's gaze seeing not anger, but triumph. The triumph of someone who had orchestrated this moment with precision. Around us, the commentary began almost instantly. My Aunt Celia shook her head and said she is single, she lives alone, she does not need that kind of money. And my Uncle Thomas muttered that girls with too much wealth end up miserable anyway. It is better for the family to manage things. One cousin whispered something about greed, another said that community matters more than personal gain, and someone at the far end of the table added that I should be grateful to contribute since I had no real responsibilities. As they spoke, I felt the now familiar sensation of slipping into a role they expected me to play, the quiet girl who absorbs every blow without complaint, the girl who survives humiliation because she has learned there is no protection in this family, no shield but the one she builds in silence. I took a slow breath and let their words wash over me, not because they did not hurt, but because hurt had long ago become an old companion, predictable in its arrival. Linda continued speaking as if delivering a speech she had rehearsed for weeks. She said that wealth should be shared, that family comes first, that Brianna has real dreams and deserves a stable start. She then added in a pitying voice that someone like me would never use that kind of money properly because people who live through computers do not understand what life is about, and the room murmured in agreement as if this judgment were self-evident truth. My father cleared his throat and said, "Chloe, this is not unreasonable. Try to see the bigger picture," and that sentence hit harder than all the others because it confirmed what I had sensed for months. He had chosen his comfort over my dignity again. I felt an odd calm settle inside me, not numbness, but clarity. And I looked down at my plate, letting the voices blur into meaningless sounds until Linda reached beneath her chair and pulled out a neat folder decorated with holly stickers, placing it before me with exaggerated care. Inside, she said, is a financial advisory proposal to help you make responsible decisions, and she opened the folder to reveal several documents printed on crisp paper. But as I scanned the first page, I realized this was not advice. It was a near full authorization for them to manage my assets, a disguised attempt to seize control of everything I owned. Linda smiled as if offering me a gift and said kindly that I should sign it tonight so the family could move forward united, and my heartbeat slowed to a steady thud as I noticed something chilling in the corner of the page, a signature at the bottom. My signature, or rather a shaky imitation of it, the kind someone creates while practicing in secret. The room dimmed slightly around the edges as I understood the depth of their preparation. This was not emotional manipulation or impulsive greed. This was premeditated, constructed piece by piece, and they had not even bothered to hide it. Brianna leaned forward eagerly, waiting for me to take the pen Linda offered, and I felt something old inside me snap with a quiet, decisive finality. I did not raise my voice. I did not demand the room to stop instead. I lifted the folder slowly and studied the forged signature, letting the weight of the moment settle into my bones, and then I closed the folder with deliberate care, pushing it back toward Linda with a steady hand, the conversation around us falling silent as everyone realized the script was no longer unfolding the way they expected. I met Linda's eyes, seeing the first flicker of unease there, because she had counted on my compliance, not my resistance. And she certainly had not counted on what would follow in the days ahead, days that would unravel everything they believed they controlled. I rose from the table with a steadiness that felt almost foreign to me, as if some deeper version of myself had finally taken the wheel, and while the room buzzed with whispers and the rustle of shifting chairs, I simply pushed my own chair back into place, thanked everyone for the meal, in a voice so calm it unsettled even Linda, then walked toward the front door without looking back, the cold air rushing into my lungs the second I stepped outside, grounding me in a way their voices never had, and by the time I reached my car, I knew that something irreversible had shifted not in them, but in me. The drive from Cedar Park to Austin was quiet, except for the faint hum of the tires against the asphalt streetlights gliding past in long bands of gold. And while the holiday traffic thinned around me, I finally allowed myself to exhale the betrayal settling into a clear outline rather than a sting, and I reached for my phone, tapping the number of the financial attorney who had helped me set up Quiet North Holdings, hearing his tired voice pick up before I even finished the first ring. I told him everything in a low, steady tone, describing the forged signature, the folder the demand shouted across the dinner table, and he did not interrupt except to ask me to text him photos, which I did the moment I stopped at a red light watching the images send, watching my own reflection stare back at me through the screen with a mixture of disbelief and dawning resolve. By the time I reached my apartment in Austin, the night had deepened into a soft winter quiet, the kind that usually soothed me, yet tonight it sharpened my focus, pushing me toward my desk, where I opened my laptop and signed into my bank accounts, navigating through each security page with a slowness that allowed me to absorb every detail, every timestamp, until the pattern emerged clearly. 3 login attempts each from the same IP address, each tied to the Wi-Fi network at my father's house, each attempt requesting to view assets rather than simple balance checks, and the fact that all 3 occurred just hours before the Christmas dinner told me that the performance tonight had not been sudden outrage, but the final act of a plan conceived long before I arrived. I felt no panic, only a growing stillness inside as I began the practical steps of reclaiming control, steps I should have taken earlier but had postponed out of a misplaced hope that my family would let me exist without seeing me as a resource to mine. I started by changing every password across every account, creating long strings of unrelated words and numbers, then enabling multi-factor authentication on each platform, listening to the soft vibration of verification codes arriving on my phone, the small pings layering into a quiet rhythm that matched my determination. Next, I logged into the primary account containing what remained of the liquidity payout and initiated transfers, moving every dollar into Quiet North Holdings, the Delaware LLC. They knew nothing about the LLC, whose structure made the funds inaccessible to anyone but me. And as each confirmation appeared on my screen, I felt a new sense of solidity forming beneath me, not triumph, but certainty. When the last transfer cleared, I opened a smaller checking account, one that still had about $50,000 in it, and I paused for a moment considering its purpose, then left it untouched, understanding instinctively that people motivated by entitlement cannot resist what they believe they deserve, meaning this account would serve as the perfect bait, a financial decoy that would reveal intent more clearly than any confrontation. I closed the laptop, letting silence fill the room, and finally allowed myself to lie down, exhaustion pulling at my limbs. Yet even as sleep edged closer, my mind stayed alert, replaying the dinner table, the eyes watching me, the certainty in Linda's voice. And I realized that today had not been an explosion, but a confirmation, the moment the truth I had long sensed finally showed itself without disguise. When morning light filtered through my curtains, I reached for my phone, instinctively not expecting anything, yet not surprised when I saw a fraud alert notification glowing on the lock screen, a quiet announcement of what I already knew would happen. I opened the alert, slowly letting each word sink in, and there it was, a failed transfer attempt of $50,000 from the bait account to an account jointly held by Linda. And my father attempted at 6:43 in the morning, denied automatically due to new authentication requirements, creating a perfect digital trail of their intentions. My heart did not race my breath, did not quicken. Instead, I felt a clean, cold clarity wash through me as I sat upright, absorbing what this meant. Not just failed theft, but documented evidence of conscious action, a line crossed with unmistakable certainty. And for the first time in years, I felt something close to power settle into my chest, not vengeful, not cruel, simply aligned with truth. I stood and walked to the window, watching the quiet streets of Austin begin their morning rhythm. People walking dogs, cars, warming up sunlight, touching the tops of trees. And I realized that the world had not ended last night, even though some part of my relationship with my father had. And standing in that golden stillness, I understood that revenge did not always require fire or fury. Sometimes it required nothing more than stepping aside and allowing people to reveal exactly who they are. The failed transfer sat on my phone like a small, silent testimony, irrefutable and precise, and as I prepared coffee and let its warmth fill my hands, I knew this was only the beginning of a path I had not intended to walk, but was now fully committed to a path shaped not by anger, but by strategy, by quiet intelligence, by the knowledge that sometimes the most powerful response is not the loud one, but the one that unfolds methodically, undeniably, and in full alignment with the truth they tried so hard to twist. The moment I finished my coffee, I sat down at my desk again, the morning light cutting across the room in a clean line, as if marking the boundary between everything that came before and everything I was about to do, and with a calmness that surprised even me. I opened my laptop and began the process of reporting the attempted theft, navigating through the bank portal with steady fingers attaching screenshots of the failed transfer, the timestamps, the IP addresses that led straight back to my father's house, and then uploading images of the forged signature from the folder Linda had presented at dinner, each detail forming a clear narrative that no one could dispute. When the fraud representative called me a short while later, I explained everything in the same measured tone I used when presenting data patterns at work, laying out facts rather than emotions, and the woman on the phone listened quietly before telling me she was elevating the case to their fraud unit because the evidence was substantial, and the pattern suggested premeditation, her voice softening when she added that these situations are always hardest when they involve family. Within an hour, the bank initiated a freeze on all activity linked to the accounts Linda and my father held within their system, a standard protective measure designed to prevent further unauthorized attempts. And as she walked me through the steps, I realized how empowering clarity could be, how numbers and records and digital footprints could speak loudly even when I chose not to. I knew many viewers of my story would not be familiar with how banks handle fraud cases, so I tried to frame it in simple terms in my own mind, understanding that a freeze means the account is placed in a locked state that prevents outgoing transfers or credit advances until the investigation is complete, and a flagged account means any transaction going forward will be scrutinized, often manually slowing down their financial life significantly, which in this case was unavoidable given how they had attempted to access my funds. After finalizing the report, I logged into my own accounts again, checking that every transfer into Quiet North Holdings had cleared, feeling the subtle relief of seeing each confirmation, and then I opened the settings for my father's mortgage, where for years I had quietly contributed automatic payments each month, payments he never acknowledged, and payments Linda likely claimed as her own support. I hovered over the cancellation button for only a moment before clicking it, watching the screen update to show the transfer schedule terminated, and although part of me felt a faint sting of sadness, it was quickly replaced by something steadier, the recognition that continuing to subsidize people who weaponized my generosity was no longer kindness, but self-harm. To ensure full transparency, I drafted a formal letter addressed to my father and Linda, detailing the $80,000 I had paid toward his medical debt years ago, attaching bank statements as proof, and requesting repayment in writing. Not because I expected them to return it, but because I knew the legal implications of having clear documented evidence of the loan evidence that would contradict any claims that I owed them support or had been financially dependent on them, flipping the narrative back to truth. As I printed the documents and placed them into a thin folder, my phone buzzed with another fraud department notification, this time confirming that during their initial review, they had discovered multiple recent credit pulls connected to the address in Cedar Park, and when I logged into the county property system to double-check, I discovered something that tightened the air in my chest for a moment, not with fear, but with disbelief that quickly hardened into comprehension. My father and Linda had opened a home equity line of credit on the house, borrowing $120,000 against the property, a risky decision for people in their financial position, and the reasoning section of the application claimed stable supporting income evidenced by recurring external deposits. Those deposits were mine, the monthly transfers I had sent for years out of love for my father, and they had used that stability to justify taking on more debt they likely intended to cover, using the money they now demanded from me, creating a loop of dependency that benefited them but trapped me. I sat back slowly and let the realization settle, feeling neither anger nor shock, but a kind of weary clarity, the kind that comes when scattered pieces finally align into one coherent picture. And as I traced the sequence in my mind, it became obvious that their entitlement was not a sudden eruption born from envy of my liquidity event, but a long patterned belief that my money, my labor, and my stability existed to sustain their choices. The bank representative called again to explain the implications of the HELOC tied to fraudulent supporting income, saying that if the investigation concluded that they had used my transfers deceptively, it could affect the validity of the loan and place additional pressure on their credit profile. And I thanked her calmly, recognizing that consequences were unfolding through systems far more objective than I could ever be. I spent the rest of the morning compiling everything into a secure digital folder, labeling each file by date, ensuring there was a clear timeline that would be impossible for anyone to twist. And when I finally closed my laptop, I felt an unfamiliar but deeply grounding sensation spreading through me, the awareness that I was no longer reacting, but strategizing, no longer shrinking, but stepping fully into the space I had earned. I walked to the window again, watching the movement of people starting their day, a dog tugging its owner along the sidewalk, a delivery truck stopping at the curb, a woman jogging with bright determination, and for a moment, the ordinariness of the world felt soothing, reminding me that crises do not overshadow everything, they simply illuminate what has been hidden. My revenge was not a dramatic act of destruction. It was the gradual application of boundaries, truth, and financial literacy tools far more powerful than rage. And as the sunlight warmed the side of my face, I understood with absolute certainty that this was only the beginning of the reckoning they had demanded without realizing what they were inviting. 2 days after the bank confirmed the freeze on my father's and Linda's accounts, I received a call from Linda that startled me, not because it was unexpected, but because of the tone she used, a strained sweetness layered over irritation, as she said she wanted to talk like adults and not drag the family through lawyers. Her voice wobbling just enough to suggest she believed this approach might still work on me, though we both knew it had always been her preferred weapon to appear reasonable while demanding the unreasonable. I paused long enough for her to grow nervous. Then I told her calmly that I was open to meeting and suggested a small family-style restaurant in South Austin, a place I knew well where conversations rose and fell in soft waves, where cameras above the counter captured everything clearly, and where servers circulated constantly enough to become unwitting witnesses. Because if Linda planned to corner me again, I wanted the truth to exist, not only in memory, but in recorded detail. When I arrived, I chose a booth near the window, sliding into the cracked vinyl seat as I discreetly tapped my Apple Watch, activating the recording function, and placed my phone on the table, angled slightly upward in a way that appeared casual but captured audio cleanly, a precaution that felt less like revenge and more like self-defense, the kind women learn to wield only after trust has been eroded to dust. Linda and Brianna entered moments later, both wearing expressions of manufactured concern. Brianna holding a designer purse she could never afford without debt. And they sat across from me as if they were the wounded parties, and I the aggressor, a dynamic they had long relied on to manipulate sympathy. The server approached with water and menus, and I waited until she stepped away before speaking, keeping my voice gentle, asking how they were holding up a softness that seemed to embolden them, because within seconds the facade cracked, and Linda leaned forward sharply, dropping the pretense entirely as she hissed that if I did not transfer the money soon, they would tell the entire extended family that I had manipulated my father for years, painting myself as the dutiful daughter while secretly controlling him. I felt the words land with their intended weight, but instead of reacting, I simply folded my hands on the table, letting the silence stretch until Brianna broke in her tone sharper, telling me that Linda had raised me for 20 years and that the $25 million was essentially overdue payment for her labor for the roof she provided for the food I ate, for the room I slept in, as if love had never existed there, only transactional calculations I had somehow failed to fulfill. Their voices rose and fell with growing intensity, unaware or uncaring that their justifications contradicted each other with every sentence, and I nodded slowly, prompting them gently with questions like, "And that is what you think is fair, or you believe I owe you these things," my tone curious rather than confrontational, guiding them to speak more freely, more boldly, which they did with surprising ease, as if entitlement had dissolved the last barrier of caution. The server returned briefly to refill iced tea, and Linda shot her an absent smile before turning back to me, lowering her voice to what she thought was a private pitch, but still easily audible to the next table, as she said they had already tried to move some money from my account, but the bank blocked it. Her frustration spilling into the open as she complained that banks were too strict these days and made things difficult for families who needed to help each other. I felt my breath still for a moment, not from shock, but from the satisfaction of hearing the exact admission I had hoped to capture, the kind of explicit confession that no lawyer could twist, that no explanation could soften. And I watched the server pause slightly as she walked away, her brow lifting just enough to suggest she had heard more than a snippet. I kept my expression neutral, thanking Linda softly for being honest, then guiding her again to expand, asking what she meant by trying to move money, and she launched into a rambling complaint about how the passwords changed, and she suspected I had set up some kind of complicated system, and Brianna chimed in, frustrated, saying they had only wanted a small portion that they deserved, at least that much. That it was unfair I guarded it so tightly when I had no husband or children to spend it on. I let the statements flow, each sentence a shovel digging deeper into their own claims, and while they spoke, I observed the room around us, the gentle clatter of plates, the hum of conversation, the distant ring of the kitchen bell, details that rooted me in the moment and reminded me that life continued around us even as their lies collapsed under the weight of their own arrogance. When the server returned again, she lingered an extra beat, glancing at me with a look that said she understood more than she voiced, perhaps recognizing a familiar ache in what she overheard, and I met her eyes, briefly offering a small appreciative nod, knowing the presence of an unbiased witness could matter later. Linda shifted tactics, then softening her voice, attempting to pivot to guilt, reminding me of holidays spent together, of times she claimed to have supported me, emotionally rewriting history with the ease of someone accustomed to being believed, but her veneer cracked when I asked quietly why she felt entitled to funds she had not earned, and her face tightened as she said, "Because we made you who you are, and you owe us a line delivered with such confidence that I almost admired the consistency of her delusion." The weight of their entitlement filled the booth like a second atmosphere, and I listened without breaking eye contact, feeling neither fear nor anger, but a deep, resolute calm, the kind that comes when truth is no longer negotiable. When they finished their tirade, I leaned back slightly, letting a slow breath settle through me, and thanked them for being honest about their intentions, their attempts, their beliefs. And as confusion flickered across their faces, I knew they had not yet realized that every word had been recorded cleanly, that their own voices now formed the backbone of the case that would follow, that their confidence had delivered them into exposure with no intervention required. I stood gathering my bag, telling them gently that the conversation had been very helpful, and that I would follow up soon, leaving them sitting in the booth, surrounded by half-eaten plates and cooling drinks, unaware that the evidence of their entitlement, their manipulation, and their attempted theft was already secured, time-stamped and ready to become the golden proof they never imagined would exist. The following week, the bank scheduled a meeting at the Cedar Park branch, a modest brick building with wide glass windows that reflected the pale winter light. And as I walked through the sliding doors, I felt an unexpected sense of stillness settle over me. Not triumph, not dread, simply readiness. The quiet resolve of someone who had learned to stop apologizing for protecting herself. The manager, a calm woman named Harris with sharp eyes and a practiced, steady tone, greeted me and guided me to a small conference room where a rectangular wooden table sat beneath fluorescent lights that buzzed faintly, the room unremarkable yet perfect in its simplicity, because truth did not require grandeur to matter. A moment later, my father and Linda entered together. Linda wearing a shade of lipstick brighter than usual, as if armor could be painted on my father, looking uneasy and older somehow, and trailing behind them was a compliance officer carrying a thin laptop and a stack of printed documents, his expression neutral in the way of people who deal in facts rather than emotion. We all took seats, the chairs scraping lightly against the floor, and for a brief moment the only sound in the room was the faint tapping of the compliance officer opening his computer, and I felt the tension thicken as Linda folded her arms, glancing around as though evaluating whether she could charm her way through the situation. Manager Harris began by explaining the purpose of the meeting, her voice measured, and professional, stating that there had been flagged activity requiring clarification from all parties, and when she gestured for me to begin, I slid a folder from my bag and placed it gently on the table, opening it slowly so every page was visible, each sheet a clean, calm record of what had been done. First, I laid out the screenshots of the login attempts highlighting the matching IP addresses, the timestamps, the failed access requests, presenting them with the same composed clarity I used when delivering reports in meetings at work, explaining only what was necessary, leaving no room for interpretation. Then I played the audio recording from the restaurant, the tiny speaker of my phone filling the room with Linda's own voice, as she admitted they had attempted to move money from my account and that the bank had blocked it. Her tone sharp and irritated as she complained about strict security measures, and in the enclosed room the words felt even more jarring than when I first heard them bouncing off the sterile walls with undeniable finality. My father closed his eyes briefly as the recording continued, while Linda stiffened her face, paling under the fluorescent lights, her confidence faltering as she realized her own voice had become evidence unfiltered and unalterable. Next, I slid forward the printed pages of the financial document she'd tried to make me sign at Christmas dinner, pointing calmly to the imitation of my signature, showing how the strokes were inconsistent with my actual handwriting, and the compliance officer leaned in to examine it more closely, nodding slowly as he took notes, the quiet scratching of his pen adding weight to the moment. For several seconds, no one spoke, the silence stretching long enough to make the air feel heavy, until Manager Harris folded her hands, looked directly at Linda and my father, and spoke with a firmness that carried no judgment, only fact, as she said, "This is attempted financial fraud against your own daughter." The sentence landed like a physical blow in the small room, echoing in a way that seemed to strip away all remaining illusions, and Linda immediately lunged forward with denials, her voice rising as she claimed misunderstandings, miscommunication, that she had only been trying to protect family assets, but each excuse unraveled the next, her words tripping over themselves as she attempted to claw back control. My father, by contrast, seemed to shrink into his chair, his hands trembling slightly as he stared at the table, the truth settling into the lines of his face, and I felt a brief flicker of something like grief for the man who had once lifted me onto his shoulders during 4th of July parades, a man who somewhere along the years had traded his voice for the comfort of avoiding conflict. Brianna, sitting beside them with heavily lined eyes, looked stunned. The kind of stunned that comes not from guilt, but from the shock of realizing entitlement has visible consequences. Her mouth falling open as she whispered that she had not known it was this serious a phrase that revealed everything about her worldview and nothing about mine. The compliance officer then cleared his throat and explained calmly that because the attempted transfer had originated from their accounts, and because the admission was recorded, the bank was obligated to freeze not only their existing accounts, but the entire home equity line of credit tied to their property, pending a deeper fraud investigation, meaning no more withdrawals, no credit extensions, no ability to shift payments to new lines, effectively placing their financial life in a holding pattern that could last weeks or months. Linda erupted again, insisting this was excessive, that families should not be punished for misunderstandings, but the manager continued outlining how the case would now be escalated to the bank's fraud department, where investigators would determine whether misleading income representations had been used to secure the HELOC, and if so, their credit score, borrowing capacity, and repayment structure could be significantly impacted, possibly for years. My father whispered something like, "This cannot be happening," his voice cracking under the weight of consequences he never imagined would touch him, and I felt a mixture of sorrow and clarity, because this was not punishment I designed. It was a chain reaction of their own decisions, illuminated by the simple act of exposing truth. At that moment, the branch door opened somewhere outside the conference room, a faint chime signaling another customer entering the bank. But what drew my attention was the subtle glance exchanged between the compliance officer and a staff member passing by a woman who paused momentarily at the open doorway. Recognition lighting her face as she looked at Linda and my father, a recognition that told me she knew them not only as customers, but as fellow members of the same church congregation they attended every Sunday. In a small community like Cedar Park, news moves faster than wind, especially when carried by people who value accountability, and I understood instantly that this story would not remain confined to the walls of the bank, not because I wanted to humiliate them, but because truth has a way of traveling once spoken aloud. Linda noticed the woman too, and her face drained of color, the implications settling onto her shoulders like a weight far heavier than anything I could have designed, and in that moment I realized that exposure was not an act of vengeance, but a natural unfolding, the inevitable result of actions carried out in secrecy, finally being brought into daylight. When the meeting ended and the manager thanked us for our cooperation, I gathered my folder slowly, not with triumph, but with a quiet dignity, feeling the shift in the room as I stood, the power dynamic no longer tilted against me. And as I walked past the glass windows toward the parking lot, I felt the winter air fill my lungs again, crisp and steady, reminding me that sunlight does not need to be harsh. To be revealing, it only needs to be honest. In the days that followed the meeting at the Cedar Park branch, the consequences that had been outlined in calm technical language began unfolding with the slow, relentless precision of a machine built for accountability, each piece clicking into place, not because I pushed it, but because their own choices had already set the gears in motion long before I ever reported anything. And by the end of the first week, it became clear that the freeze on the home equity line of credit had done more than inconvenience them. It had exposed how precariously they had been balancing their financial life on assumptions that I would always step in to cushion the impact of their decisions. Linda was the first to feel the weight of it when her credit card company declined a payment she had attempted to make in order to keep her highest limit card active, a card she relied on to maintain the appearance of affluence she cherished. And when the auto draft for her salon rent bounced, the landlord sent a curt notice demanding immediate payment and warning that a second missed deadline would initiate eviction proceedings, a notice I knew she would read with dread, not only because she risked losing her business, but because losing the salon meant losing the identity she had crafted for herself in the community as a woman who had risen above her beginnings. Meanwhile, her car loan, a note on a mid-range SUV, she upgraded to after my liquidity event, even though she had no real increase in income, went unpaid for 2 cycles, triggering calls from the lender and late fees that piled onto her mounting credit stress, each bill arriving like a reminder that the lifestyle she flaunted had never been supported by her own earnings, but by a mix of borrowed stability and borrowed confidence that evaporated now that the system flagged her accounts. The fallout extended to Brianna, who had been days away from signing a lease on a stylish apartment in downtown Round Rock, a building filled with rooftop pools and curated aesthetics designed for social media backdrops. And when the leasing office ran the routine credit check, they saw not only her own lackluster score, but the plummeting household index tied to her parents' financial crisis, causing the application to be denied, and she reportedly spent hours calling different landlords trying to explain that it was a misunderstanding that she deserved the place, but entitlement is not a sufficient replacement for numbers that do not add up. My father began unraveling more quietly, his pride eroding in slow, painful layers as late notices appeared for utilities and the remaining mortgage balance notices that revealed a truth he had been shielding himself from for years, that the stability he believed he had maintained for his family had in fact been propped up by my quiet monthly deposits and by accumulating debt he had agreed to without fully understanding its implications. And for the first time, he could not hide behind Linda's confidence because even she no longer had ground to stand on. He spent mornings sitting in the backyard, according to a neighbor who emailed me out of concern, staring at the shed he repainted every spring, as if searching for a version of his life where he had protected his daughter, instead of enabling someone who saw her only as a financial solution. While they spiraled, I continued my routines, attending meetings for my new remote position, taking evening walks along Lady Bird Lake, cooking simple meals and maintaining the calm that had become both my shield and my compass. Yet the universe delivered a twist I had not expected when an email arrived from a women's entrepreneurial support fund based in Austin, a small grant program designed to uplift local female business owners, informing me that an application submitted by Linda had been flagged for verification because she had listed herself as the foundational creator of a delivery optimization software that had recently been acquired for $25 million. For a long moment, I sat in silence, absorbing the audacity layered into that single claim, the ease with which she had attempted to rewrite the narrative of my own career, presenting my years of labor and sleepless nights as her intellectual property. Her contribution, her proof of worthiness for a grant intended for women who built something themselves rather than siphoned it from others. The program administrator asked whether I could confirm any details about the software's origins because something in the application seemed inconsistent, and instead of replying with anger, I composed a simple, concise message containing a link to the official acquisition announcement articles profiling me as part of the early Cartwave team, and documentation proving my role in the product development timeline, attaching nothing more than facts, because facts had carried me this far without the need for embellishment. I pressed send with a calm, steady breath, and within hours I received a reply thanking me for the clarification informing me that Linda's application had been formally removed from consideration and annotated with a note indicating deliberate misrepresentation, a mark that would shadow her in future attempts to secure support from local business programs. Knowing this did not bring me joy, but a deeper sense of closure, an understanding that actions rooted in entitlement always reveal themselves eventually, and that my role was not to punish her, but to stop cleaning up the consequences she created. Meanwhile, the community began to whisper, not out of malice, but because financial scandals in small towns have a way of surfacing no matter how tightly someone tries to seal the cracks, and church members exchanged quiet nods and concerned glances. When Linda entered late one Sunday, her makeup more heavily applied than usual, her smile strained as she pretended everything was unchanged, even as her world contracted around her. My father walked behind her with bowed shoulders, no longer attempting to defend her or explain away the growing distance between them and the rest of their social circles, and I felt a complicated mix of grief and release, watching from afar, because while I never wished humiliation upon him, I could no longer cushion him from the consequences of his participation in a scheme that was always destined to collapse. The money revenge was not flashy, not cinematic, but it was real, documented, measurable, unfolding through letters and balance sheets and flagged accounts, a slow, steady unraveling of the financial web they had woven from my silence, and as each thread snapped, another layer of truth settled into place. Truth that no longer needed my voice to stay upright, because the paper trail spoke louder than anything I could ever say. Weeks passed after Linda's failed grant application, and the ripples of their unraveling continued spreading through Cedar Park each day, carrying a new layer of silence from their end, until one evening, my phone lit up with my father's name, a name I had not heard spoken aloud in weeks, and when I answered, his voice trembled in a way I had not heard since I was a child, as though he was trying to hold together a structure that had already collapsed beneath him, telling me that Linda was being avoided by her salon clients, that friends she once invited to backyard barbecues no longer returned her calls, that the landlord had issued a final notice and was preparing to reclaim the space because she could not meet even the minimum payment required to halt eviction. And while he spoke, he added that Brianna had been rejected from several rental applications, that she was sleeping on a friend's couch, that she cried every night, insisting no one understood how unfairly life was treating her. He hesitated before continuing, asking if I could help them one last time, saying that even if mistakes had been made, we were still family, trying to wrap the word family around a plea for rescue, as though the sound of it could erase everything that had happened on Christmas night, everything they had chosen to do behind my back, everything they had taken without asking. I listened without interrupting, letting him fill the silence with explanations about stress and confusion and misunderstandings. And when he finally went quiet, I felt a familiar ache in my chest, not for the man on the line, but for the little girl I once was, the girl who would have done anything to hear her father stand up for her just once. Hours later, an email arrived from Linda, written in a tone wrapped in brittle politeness, where she apologized for her outbursts and blamed everything on stress, claiming she had only pushed so hard because she feared for Brianna's future, insisting she never meant to hurt me, and that a contribution from me would be the gesture that healed the family. The next morning, Brianna sent a message through social media saying, "You have proved your point. Can you just help us now?" Followed by a string of sad face emojis, as if depicting sorrow could substitute for accountability. And I sat there staring at the glowing screen, realizing that none of them understood the difference between regret and inconvenience, that they were not apologizing for what they had done, but for the consequences they had received. After 2 days of silence, I texted my father, suggesting we meet at the park near Ladybird Lake, a place where the water carried a calming rhythm and families walked dogs along the path, a space where I could speak without anger because the air itself steadied me. And when he arrived, he looked smaller than I remembered, his shoulders curved inward, as if shielding himself from a storm that never stopped. We sat on a bench overlooking the lake, and for a while neither of us spoke, letting the sounds of joggers and distant laughter fill the space between us. And when he finally looked at me with eyes that carried both longing and apology, I felt the familiar tug of wanting to comfort him, but I did not move because comforting him had been my role since I was 9, and I was no longer willing to play it. I said softly, "Dad, the night you sat there and watched her take everything from me, you made your choice. I am just respecting it." And the words hung in the cool air like a gentle but immovable truth. And I saw the moment he understood that I was not being cruel. I was simply stepping out of the role they had assigned me since childhood, the role that required me to sacrifice my peace to keep everyone else afloat. He tried to explain, tried to tell me he was overwhelmed, tried to insist he thought I was strong enough to handle it, and I nodded because I no longer needed him to admit anything. I no longer needed an apology from a man who had spent his life avoiding conflict at the cost of his daughter's well-being. Cameras clicked from people walking by and geese drifted along the shoreline, and the world continued moving even as the man beside me finally confronted the wreckage his silence had allowed. Yet I felt no urge to soften the truth for him, no instinct to protect him from his own reflection. When we stood up to leave, he reached for a hug, but I stepped back gently, telling him to take care of himself. And the way his hand dropped to his side told me he finally realized I meant every word. That night in my quiet apartment, I opened my laptop and reviewed the documents for Quiet North Holdings, the LLC that now represented not only my financial future, but the boundary I had erected between myself and the people who once viewed me as their safety net. And as I scrolled, I thought about the thousands of women who had written to me over the years in online forums describing what it felt like to carry a family that only saw them as a resource. It occurred to me then that there were women in my own city facing the same financial suffocation. I had escaped women whose families drained their paychecks, controlled their accounts, or opened credit lines in their names. Women who needed support not from a daughter or a sister, but from a system that believed them. So I researched local organizations that provided legal and financial help to women leaving coercive environments. And I found one that specialized in rebuilding credit and offering safe housing. With a steady breath, I authorized a significant donation routed through Quiet North Holdings, so my name would remain absent from the paperwork, not because I feared anyone discovering it, but because I wanted the contribution to exist without emotional strings, a gift that expected nothing in return, a gesture that aligned with the woman I had become, rather than the girl who grew up believing her value depended on what she gave away. When the confirmation email arrived, I closed my laptop and sat back in the dim light of my living room, realizing that giving to them filled a space inside me that my father's call had hollowed out. And I understood that my story was no longer about taking revenge, but about reclaiming agency, choosing where my energy and resources flowed, and refusing to let guilt or manipulation steer my decisions again. The following morning, I looked out at the sunrise filtering through my window and felt a sense of stillness I had not known in years, a stillness rooted in the knowledge that I had finally stepped out of the role my family had assigned me and into the life I had chosen for myself, a life where my boundaries were not negotiable and where my worth was not measured by how much of myself I was willing to give away. In the weeks after that quiet sunrise, something inside me settled into a rhythm I had never known, a rhythm shaped not by urgency or obligation, but by choice. And with that steadying clarity, I made a decision that felt both inevitable and deeply personal. I packed up my Austin apartment and drove south towards San Antonio, the city where I was born and the place where my mother's memories still lived in the soft corners of childhood streets. And after a few days of searching, I found a modest townhouse on a quiet road lined with pecan trees, a home small enough to feel manageable, yet bright enough to feel like a beginning rather than a retreat. I signed the deed in silence, feeling no need to announce this step to anyone. And when I unlocked the door for the first time, the emptiness of the rooms felt comforting rather than lonely. A blank canvas waiting for a life I would build deliberately rather than reactively. And that night, I slept under a simple cotton blanket on a mattress on the floor, listening to the distant hum of traffic and realizing I had not felt this safe since childhood. In the mornings, I began walking through the neighborhood, tracing quiet loops past mailboxes and uneven sidewalks while the Texas sunrise painted the sky in pale orange. And the movement untangled thoughts that had knotted inside me for years, thoughts about survival and loyalty and the cost of silence. And with every step, I felt the weight of old expectations fall further behind me. My work continued from a small desk in the corner of the living room, where I joined video meetings for a new company that valued my skills without demanding my identity. And I discovered that I no longer needed titles or applause to feel competent. I only needed the freedom to use my mind in ways that did not drain me. As autumn settled in, I launched a weekly online class titled Financial Self-Defense for Women, a space where women from across the country logged in to learn how to safeguard accounts, understand credit, identify coercive tactics, and build stability even in households that dismiss their concerns. And as I watched their names appear on the screen each week, I felt something inside me rebuild something that had been fractured by years of being treated as a financial resource rather than a person. On Saturdays, I volunteered with a nonprofit that supported women fleeing financial abuse, helping them read loan documents and dispute fraudulent charges and understand the power of a single, well-placed boundary. And each time I sat with a woman whose story echoed my own, I felt the purpose behind my choices sharpen, not out of revenge, but out of recognition, a sense that healing becomes stronger when shared. Occasionally, I drove to the cemetery where my mother rested, bringing a small bouquet of wildflowers and sitting beside her headstone in quiet reflection. And each visit felt less like mourning and more like a conversation with the woman who had given me my resilience, the woman who had saved money for my future, even when she had so little a gesture that had been erased by others but never forgotten by me. And in those moments, I allowed myself to acknowledge the journey from the little girl whose college fund had disappeared without warning to the woman who now taught others how to protect their financial futures. The arc of my life stretched before me like a long, quiet river, winding from the first betrayal buried in childhood through the shock of being told at 29 to hand over $25 million because I did not deserve what I had earned, to the moment I found the strength to say no without raising my voice to walk away, not because I stopped caring, but because caring had cost me too much. I no longer replayed the Christmas dinner in my mind, no longer imagined different versions of what I could have said or done, because I finally understood that I did not need to destroy them to win. I only needed to stop letting them destroy me a truth that arrived not as anger, but as peace, a soft, undeniable clarity that settled into every part of my new life. I furnished the townhouse slowly, deliberately, choosing only what felt necessary: a wooden bookshelf, a small dining table, a framed photograph of a hiking trail I loved, and as the space filled, it did not feel crowded. It felt lived and shaped by intention, rather than expectation. Some evenings, I sat on the small balcony with a cup of tea, watching neighbors water plants or call their dogs inside, and I realized how fiercely I had once believed that family was something I had to preserve at any cost yet. Here I was discovering a version of family built not on blood or obligation, but on respect and reciprocity, the kind of family found in students thanking me for teaching them about credit reports, in volunteers who joked with me while sorting paperwork, in quiet conversations with myself where I finally spoke honestly about what I deserved. My father called once more, his voice softer this time, not asking for money, but simply saying he hoped I was well, and though I listened with compassion, I did not offer to visit, understanding that forgiveness did not require reunion, it only required truth. And the truth was that distance protected both of us from falling back into patterns neither of us could survive again. Linda never contacted me directly again, and Brianna's messages stopped after a few weeks, and the silence felt like a door gently closing, not slammed in anger, but pushed shut by the simple fact that we no longer lived in the same emotional world. Months passed in calm, steady motion, and each season layered new color onto my days, turning what once felt like exile into something that felt more like homecoming, a return, not to a place, but to myself. And now as I sit at my small desk writing this story, I think about the women who will hear it. Women who know what it feels like to shrink themselves to keep the peace. Women who have been treated like wallets instead of daughters or sisters or wives. Women who have carried families that never once asked if the weight hurt. And I want them to know that choosing yourself is not selfish. It is survival. And walking away is not failure. It is freedom. So if any part of my story feels familiar, just type "still here" or tell me where you are watching from. I read every single comment, and if you want to hear more stories of women who chose themselves and walked away from toxic families, please subscribe. You are not alone.